My wife smiled strangely as she watched me drink the coffee she gave me. The last thing I remember was her hand waving goodbye. I woke up in another country with no documents and a bank message saying my account was emptied. She sold my house while I was sedated on the plane. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. My name is Rodrigo Medina Serrano. I'm 52 years old. I've been a senior tax auditor for the tax agency of Valencia for 26 years, and my job is to find exactly what someone is trying to hide. Irregular money movements, dates that don't add up, signatures that don't match who should be signing. I've audited medium-sized companies with annual revenues of 40 million euros. I've seen directors who lied with admirable calm crumble completely when I placed the incriminating document on the table at the correct moment. I spent 3 decades of my professional life detecting others' fraud with a precision my colleagues considered almost obsessive, and I didn't see the one growing inside my own home. That's the hardest part for me to tell. Not the money, not the plane, not even the betrayal itself. What's hardest for me to admit is that I'm a man who dedicated all his energy to his work and left the door to his personal life unlocked for too long. I wasn't a present husband. There were entire seasons when I'd come home when my son Nestor was already asleep and leave the next day before he opened his eyes. Veronica managed everything: the school, the doctor's visits, the apartment repairs, the neighbors' meetings, the bills, the uncomfortable calls. I provided the money and the absence. She provided the time. Back then, I convinced myself it was a reasonable arrangement. I was wrong, and that mistake has a name and a face and a signature on several documents that you'll learn about before this story ends. I married Veronica Castillo Fuentes on September 12, 1999. She was 25 and I was 28. We met at the wedding of a college classmate in a function hall in Burgessot that smelled of plastic flowers and cheap bottled cologne. She wore a navy blue dress and had a laugh that could be heard from the other end of the room. I was a young civil servant with the first stable salary of my life, convinced that economic stability was the greatest gift I could offer someone. On our second date, she asked about my work with an attention that seemed completely genuine to me. She wanted to know how fraud was detected, what signs I looked for first, if anyone had ever come close to truly deceiving me. I talked for almost an hour without her interrupting. She listened with her eyes fixed on mine and her head slightly tilted. I thought it was intellectual curiosity. Today I understand it was a study. From that night, without my knowing it, Veronica learned exactly how an auditor thinks, and above all, she learned his blind spots. Our son Nestor was born in July 2001. We grew as a family in a 140 square meters house in the Benimaclet neighborhood in Valencia, with a small garden and a terrace from which you could see a piece of the sky that turned almost orange at sunset. It was a house with history, with marks on the doorframe where we measured Nestor's height every year, with the specific smell of old wood and morning coffee that I associated with the word home. In 2012, Veronica proposed registering the house solely in her name. I had just received a routine review file at work, something completely normal in my position, and she interpreted it as a real threat. She explained to me in great detail that if the file led to any financial liability, the house could be compromised. She talked about family protection, about foresight, that it was just a temporary measure while the file was being closed. I signed the documents with the same confidence I would have signed a shopping list for her. It was my house, she was my wife. I didn't read it line by line as I would have with any work file. That was the mistake it took me 12 years to fully understand. The notary who formalized the process was named Evaristo Salcedo Parra. Veronica recommended him. She said he'd handled her father's inheritance papers years ago, that he was trustworthy, that he was the most efficient in the neighborhood. I shook his hand, signed where they told me to, and didn't think about him again for more than a decade, until his name appeared on other documents in very different circumstances, and that handshake suddenly took on a completely different meaning. The last few months before the airport were strange in a way I couldn't interpret at the time. Veronica would make calls that she'd cut short when I entered the room. One afternoon, I found some papers on the kitchen table with the letterhead of a real estate agency I didn't recognize. When I asked what they were, She said with complete naturalness that she was looking for information for her cousin Dolores, who'd been wanting to change neighborhoods for a while. I believed her and didn't question anything. I stored that paper in a corner of my memory without giving it any importance. Only much later would I understand what those papers meant and the name that appeared printed in the lower right corner. And then came that Tuesday in February. Veronica showed up at the Valencia airport when I'd already checked my luggage. She said she didn't want me to leave without a proper goodbye. She brought me the coffee in a cardboard cup with the lid on and the name written in black marker on the side. She talked about unimportant things while I drank. That Nestor had called that morning to ask how I was, that the boiler needed to be checked before the real cold set in, that she'd take advantage of my absence to organize the hallway closets. I listened with half my mind already on the trip, drinking the coffee, standing by the boarding gate, not noticing the strange taste that should have stopped me. I moved forward, picked up my briefcase, went through the boarding gate, and turned to wave goodbye. She was smiling in a way I'd never seen before. It wasn't her usual smile. It was something wider, quieter, more fixed, as if she were storing that image to carry with her for a long time, as if it were the last time she'd see me that way, and she wanted to remember it well. I didn't know how to read it then. I know how to read it perfectly now. The next thing I remember with clarity is the dull roar of the engine and a white light that hurt my eyes. My mouth was dry, a persistent metallic taste on my tongue, and my arms were heavy as if they hadn't moved for hours. It took me almost a full minute to remember where I was. I looked at the screen on the seat in front of me, where the flight map showed the route in real time. The destination city wasn't mine. It was then that the watch on my wrist vibrated once. A notification from the bank, 5 words, and a number that couldn't be real. Available balance €0. And at that moment, inside that plane flying in a completely wrong direction, the auditor I carried inside woke up with a jolt. Because there's something Veronica never understood, something Damian never calculated, and something my own son didn't consider when he put his signature where he shouldn't have. A man who's spent his entire life tracking fraud doesn't need much time to start reconstructing one. He just needs his rage to turn into method. And that, with 52 years of accumulated experience, is exactly what I know how to do better than anyone. There's something nobody explains to you when you've spent 25 years building a life. You can come to confuse stability with truth. I confused it for too long. I convinced myself that because everything worked on the outside, everything was fine on the inside. That because the mortgage was paid, the fridge full, and the bills up to date, the rest was just the normal noise of any mature marriage. I was wrong in such a complete way that today, when I relive it, I find it hard to recognize myself in that man. I'd wake up at 6:15 in the morning, not by an alarm, but because my body has been calibrated to that routine for decades. 20 minutes for a shower, black coffee with no sugar. A review of the newspaper headlines while I waited for the coffee to cool enough to drink in one gulp. I'd arrive at the tax agency office before 8, when the hallways still smelled clean and the computers took a while to fully boot up. I liked that quiet hour before the meetings and phones started. It was when I thought best. My colleagues called me the clock, not for speed, but for accuracy. When I submitted an audit report, every figure was double-checked, every date cross-referenced against the original record. My supervisor, Amparo Villanueva, used to say my files were the only ones that didn't need an additional review before moving to the inspection phase. She didn't say it as a compliment, but as a technical description. It was simply what I did. I had that level of rigor so ingrained that I no longer perceived it as an effort, but as breathing. At home, it was different. At home, I disconnected in a way that for years I considered healthy, and that I now understand was simply a way of not looking. I'd arrive tired, eat what Veronica had prepared, listen with half an ear to what she said about her day, and by 11 my eyes were already closed. Weekends were for pending tasks, repairs, errands, a visit to my sister Consuelo, a family meal with the usual people. There was no real time to talk slowly, to ask how she really was, to observe without hurry what was happening in front of me. Nestor grew up within that framework, and he resented it more than I wanted to admit. When he was 12, he told me one afternoon that I wasn't his father, that I was a man who slept in his house. He said it with the unfiltered anger that children have when they haven't yet learned to hide what they feel. I reprimanded him. I explained that I worked so he wouldn't lack anything, and I closed the matter as if it were an ordinary dispute. I never mentioned it again. I didn't completely erase it either, although I acted for years as if I had. Over time, Nestor's resentment took another form. Less direct anger, more managed distance. When he finished his degree in business administration and management, he didn't come to celebrate with us. He said he had plans with friends. When he started working at a consulting firm in Madrid, he didn't tell us until 3 weeks later either, as if it were a minor detail not worth a call. I interpreted it as the natural independence of an adult son. Veronica always justified it. He's very busy, or you know how he is. He doesn't like a fuss. Now I understand she had very specific reasons to maintain that distance between Nestor and me. What then seemed to be the boy's way of being was actually a separation that someone had been carefully cultivating. There were signs I didn't interpret because I had no active reason to suspect. Veronica started using her phone differently approximately 18 months before the airport. She always carried it with her, which she didn't do before. When it rang at night, she'd say it was her friend Remedios, who was going through a complicated divorce and called at odd hours. Once, by accident, I saw the name that appeared on the screen before she turned the device toward the table. It wasn't Remedios. It was a single capital letter, AD. I didn't ask. I should have. A few months later, on a Saturday morning when I thought she'd gone out shopping, I found a folder on the study table with documents I hadn't seen before. It was open, as if she'd left it by mistake. It contained sheets with property valuation tables, sales price comparisons in the Benimaclet neighborhood, and a document with the letterhead of an agency called Inmobiliaria Alcantara y Asociados. In the corner of the letterhead was a name printed in small letters, Damian Fuentes, licensed agent. When Veronica returned with the shopping bags, I asked her what it was. She answered with a naturalness that had no cracks. Her cousin Dolores had been looking for a buyer for her apartment in the Campanar neighborhood for months and had asked her for guidance on market prices, that she had obtained that documentation to help her. She said it looking me directly in the eye, without hesitating, without any movement that betrayed discomfort. I closed the folder, left it where it was, and didn't think about that name again for several weeks. Only much later would I understand that Damian Fuentes wasn't cousin Dolores' agent. He was the man who'd been planning with Veronica for over a year, in detail, what was about to happen to me, and that open folder on the table hadn't been an oversight, it was a rehearsal. What makes me most uncomfortable to admit is that I had information in front of me and I didn't process it. 2 weeks before the airport, while reviewing the monthly bank statement, I noticed that 3 transfers I expected to find were missing, small amounts, between €800 and €1,100 each, corresponding to recurring domestic payments that Veronica managed regularly. I asked her if she had set them up as direct debits from another account. She told me she had reorganized the way she managed some expenses to have more control over the monthly budget. It seemed reasonable to me. I signed the statement and filed it without asking a single additional question. A tax auditor with 26 years of experience filed the statement. The only explanation I can find is that certain frauds work precisely because they happen where one stops applying rigor, not in the office, not in professional files, but in the space where one believes one doesn't need to be protected. Veronica knew it. She had spent years building that space with a patience that, had it been directed towards anything else, I could almost call admirable. But I understood that later. Before I understood it, I first had to land at an airport that wasn't mine, with empty pockets, a metallic taste on my palate that I couldn't neutralize, and a watch on my wrist that continued to vibrate with a notification that changed the meaning of everything I've just told you. For weeks before the airport, Veronica came home on a Wednesday afternoon with a different energy. It wasn't euphoria, it was something more contained, more calculated. She left her purse on the chair in the entryway, peered into the study where I was reviewing some documents, and said, "Rodrigo, I think a very good opportunity has come up for you." She handed me an envelope with the letterhead of a consulting firm called Adramar Solutions. Inside was a formal letter with all the correct elements, an institutional logo, the signature of a so-called director of international expansion, an invitation to participate in a presentation meeting for fiscal optimization project for companies with a presence in emerging markets. The indicated location was Istanbul, the dates, the first week of February. I read it with moderate attention. It wasn't unusual to receive such invitations. In previous years, I had attended similar meetings in Lisbon, in Brussels, in Milan. Veronica knew that these trips were useful for me to maintain contacts outside the usual circuit of the tax agency. She knew because I myself had explained it to her in countless conversations over the years. She had always paid attention when I talked about work. Always. Do you know this company? I asked her. Lucia, your colleague Marcos's wife, mentioned it to me. She said her husband had dealt with them last year and that they were serious. She said it with the tone of someone who has researched enough to answer, but not so much as to seem like she had prepared the answer. I looked at the letter again. The company's address in Madrid was real. The phone number existed. The director's name appeared in a quick internet search linked to a company with 3 years of registered activity. It wasn't an obvious trap. It was a trap carefully constructed by someone who knew exactly how much I would verify. Why I didn't check was whether Lucia, Marcos's wife, had actually said what Veronica claimed. I never called Marcos to confirm. It didn't seem necessary. Veronica offered to handle the travel arrangements. She said she wanted to take care of the details as a way of showing me she cared about what I did. She booked the flight, the hotel, organized the itinerary. I reviewed the documents she gave me. A plane ticket with my name, a hotel confirmation near the historic center. A schedule of meetings with names and times. Everything added up, everything had the right appearance. I know now that the flight she booked was real, but in the opposite direction from what I believed. The hotel existed, but the reservation was made in someone else's name. The meetings on the agenda were fictitious, names taken from Turkish business directories with no real link to Dreamar Solutions. When I arrived at the airport on that Tuesday in February, with my briefcase ready and my papers in order, I was the only person in that building who genuinely believed in the purpose of the trip. The morning of the departure was like any other travel morning in recent years. I got up before her. I prepared the luggage I had double-checked the night before. I had breakfast standing in the kitchen with a coffee I made myself. Veronica came down when I was almost ready, with her hair tied up in the same blue robe she had worn for years. She asked if I had slept well. I said yes, although I had been awake part of the night with my mind already on the meetings. She walked me to the car, helped me put the suitcase in the trunk. There was nothing unusual in her gestures, no visible tension, no rush for me to leave. It was the perfect routine of an ordinary farewell. When I arrived at the airport, I checked my luggage, went through security, and waited in the boarding area for almost 40 minutes. It was then that I saw her appear in the terminal. She was walking calmly, with a cardboard cup in each hand, and she explained that she had found parking and wanted to say goodbye properly before I boarded. I told her it wasn't necessary, that the flight was leaving soon. That's exactly why, she replied, and handed me one of the cups. The coffee had a slightly different taste than usual, more bitter, with an undertone I couldn't identify, but which I attributed to the different brand from the airport machine. I drank almost half of it standing by the large window overlooking the runway while she talked to me about minor things. I finished the cup before my name was called over the loudspeaker. I didn't think about the taste. I didn't think about anything other than the trip. I went through the boarding gate, turned around, and saw her on the other side of the glass. That image is the one that returns with the most clarity from that whole day. Veronica, standing still, with her arms at her sides, and that smile that wasn't hers. She didn't wave her hand abruptly, nor did she cry, nor did she make any theatrical gesture. She just smiled with a stillness that at that moment I interpreted as serenity and that I now recognize as relief. The relief of someone who has just activated the mechanism they've been preparing for months and that can no longer be stopped. What comes next is fragmented. I remember the airplane aisle. I remember the sound of the overhead compartment closing. I remember the seatbelt. I don't remember looking for the seat on the boarding pass or looking out the window during takeoff. There's a block of time that simply doesn't exist in my memory. When consciousness returned, it was progressive and confusing, like emerging from anesthesia. First, the constant, distant sound of the engine. Then the pressure of the seat on my back. Then the white light from the cabin ceiling. I opened my eyes, and it took several seconds to understand that I was sitting on a commercial airplane with the tray table folded, the emergency booklet tucked into the front pocket, and my mouth with a thick, metallic taste that I couldn't swallow. I looked at my watch. More than 3 hours had passed since boarding. I turned on the screen of the seat in front. The flight map showed the plane's position in real time. The route traced in a yellow line over the blue background of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The destination point marked on the far right of the screen was an airport whose code I didn't immediately recognize. I opened the Maps application on my smartwatch to confirm it. Istanbul, Turkey. I stared at that word for several seconds without moving. My brain took longer than usual to build a coherent hypothesis with what I was seeing. I had the plane ticket in the inner pocket of my briefcase. I took it out. I read it with the same attention I would read any work document. The ticket was correct, my name, my ID number, the flight from Valencia. But the destination that I had read as Barcelona on the confirmation Veronica had given me weeks ago said something completely different on the original ticket. I had misread it, or it had been prepared for me to misread it. By then, my wallet was no longer in my pocket, nor was my phone, only the watch on my wrist that vibrated once before the battery went to minimum. A notification from the bank, 5 words, a number that allowed no alternative interpretation. I put the ticket back in my pocket slowly, with the same mechanical calm with which I filed documents in the office when I discovered a case was worse than it first appeared. I looked out the window, clouds over the sea, the cold February light coming in at an angle through the yellowish plastic of the oval. At that moment, I didn't feel rage yet. What I felt was something colder and more precise, the exact recognition that someone had built a fraud against me with a technical competence that couldn't go unnoticed, and that I, who had dedicated my entire life to dismantling such structures, would have to start rebuilding it from the beginning. From scratch, from Istanbul. The plane touched down at Ataturk International Airport at 16:53 local time. I know because I memorized that data as soon as I could verify it, just as I memorized every relevant detail from that moment on. It was the only thing I could do, observe, record, organize. I had no money, no documentation, no immediate way to communicate with anyone, but I had my head and no one had taken that from me. The landing was smooth. Passengers began to get up before the seatbelt sign went off. As always, I remained seated until the aisle was almost completely empty. I needed that minute to finish organizing what I knew for sure and separating it from what was still conjecture, what I knew for sure. I was in Istanbul without having decided to be. My bank account showed a 0 balance. My wallet and phone had disappeared during the flight, and the ticket in my pocket indicated a destination I hadn't chosen. What was still conjecture, the exact extent of what had happened with our funds, who else was involved beyond Veronica, and what specific legal steps were possible from where I was. An auditor learns early that desperation is expensive. It consumes energy you need to think, distorts the evaluation of available information, and leads you to make decisions that complicate your position instead of improving it. I repeated this to myself as I walked down the disembarking corridor with my briefcase in hand, the only object that was still mine. Ataturk Airport is huge, noisy, and full of signs in Turkish with partial English translations. I followed the signs towards the international arrivals area. No one was waiting for me. No one had any reason to wait for me. I went through passport control with a document I kept in the inner pocket of my briefcase, which Veronica hadn't been able to steal without me noticing before boarding. The border agent checked the passport. He looked me in the eye with the neutral routine of someone who has seen 10,000 faces that week and returned it to me with a stamp. At least that was still mine. In the arrivals area, with the passport in my hand and my watch about to run out of battery, I had exactly 90 seconds to decide what to do before I lost the last channel of information I had left. I opened the watch's contact list and looked for the emergency phone number of the Spanish Consulate General in Istanbul. I had it saved from years ago, not out of any special precaution, but because it was a standard travel protocol that my department recommended keeping on the wrist device, precisely for situations where the main phone was not available. The watch died before I could dial. I stood there in the middle of the flow of passengers with my arm extended and the screen black. I breathed. I located the airport information desk with my eyes. I crossed the terminal at a normal pace and waited for the agent on duty to finish with the previous passenger. She was a woman of about 40 with dark hair tied back and a name tag that said Sealand. I spoke to her in Spanish. She didn't reply in Spanish. I tried in Italian, which I managed functionally due to years of contact with files of Italian companies based in Valencia. Sealand made a gesture of partial recognition and called a colleague who approached from the adjacent desk. The colleague's name was Tarek. He was perhaps 30 years old. He spoke acceptable Spanish with a marked accent and a genuinely helpful disposition. I briefly explained what I needed. I had lost my phone during the flight. I needed to make an urgent call to the Spanish consulate in the city and then contact a relative in Valencia. Tarek didn't ask for details, took his own service phone and handed it to me without any special protocol, as if it were something completely reasonable. In that silent gesture, there's something I still find difficult to name without my chest tightening a bit. I dialed the consulate's number from memory. I remembered it with the same clarity with which I remember the classification codes of tax files. The phone rang 4 times before a female voice answered with a correct institutional greeting. I explained the situation in precise terms. Spanish citizen in Istanbul. Primary documentation lost during the journey. Need guidance to obtain an emergency document and manage my return. The official asked for my passport number, which I provided immediately, and told me that I could go to the consular offices the next day from 9 in the morning with my original passport as provisional identification. She gave me the address on Resid Gallop Street. I repeated it to myself mentally 3 times until it was fixed. Before hanging up, I asked if they could help me arrange an emergency cash advance to cover that night's accommodation. There was a brief pause. She explained that there was a consular assistance mechanism for citizens in a situation of economic vulnerability abroad, but that it required prior verification and formal processing, that the process could be initiated the next day at the offices. One night, I had to figure out one night. I thanked Tarek for the call. He looked at me attentively for a moment and asked if I needed anything else. I said yes. I needed to know where the cheapest hotel at or near the airport was. He pointed out one a 12-minute walk away with reduced price rooms for passengers in transit. Then he added, as if thinking of it at that moment, that the night shift at the desk ended at midnight and that if I needed to make another call before then, I could come back. I don't know if he said it out of protocol or for something more human than protocol. In any case, I noted it. I walked towards the exit with my briefcase. The night air in Turkey in February was colder than I expected, humid, and with a smell of aviation fuel mixed with something like the sea. The highway lights flickered in the distance. I found the hotel without difficulty, a small and functional establishment with a sign in 3 languages and a reception lit with white fluorescent lights. At the desk, I explained that I had no cash or card, that I was a Spanish citizen with a valid passport, that I needed a room for that night, and that the next day, after handling the matter at the consulate, I could regularize the payment. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with a thin mustache and a tired expression, studied me for several seconds. Passport, he said. I handed it to him. He examined it, made a copy. He returned the original to me. Room 311, 4th floor. Payment tomorrow before 12. He gave me a magnetic card and pointed to the elevator. I went up to the room. It was small, with a single bed, a chair, a narrow table, and a window that overlooked an inner courtyard where there was nothing to see. I sat on the edge of the bed with the briefcase on my lap and remained motionless for several minutes. It wasn't the first time in my professional life that I'd found myself facing a perfectly executed fraud. What was the first time was that the victim was me and that the perpetrator was someone who had slept beside me for 24 years. I opened the briefcase, took out the work folder I always carried for trips, paper, pen, dividers. I placed a blank sheet on the narrow table and wrote at the top in clear letters the date, Tuesday, February 6th, 2024. Below I wrote a single line, what I know, what I suspect, what I need to confirm. And I started to work, not with rage, not with the broken impulse of someone who has just been hit, with the cold and systematic method of a man who has spent more than 2 decades dismantling fraudulent structures, and who knows, with a certainty that no personal betrayal can alter. That every irregularity leaves a trail, that documents don't lie if you know where to look, and that the person who thought they had left me without resources didn't calculate the only thing that mattered, that the most dangerous resource I have was never in that bank account. It was in my head, and it was still intact. The Spanish Consulate General in Istanbul occupies a building with a discreet facade in the Levant neighborhood, with a flag over the main entrance and a small waiting room with orange plastic chairs that looked like they'd been there since the 90s. I arrived at 8:42 in the morning, before they opened, and waited standing on the sidewalk with my briefcase, passport, and the 3 pages of notes I had written the night before on the narrow table in room 311. The night had been long. I didn't sleep more than 2 hours straight, not due to anguish, but due to mental activity. Every time I closed my eyes, my brain continued to catalog data, cross-reference dates, identify gaps in the sequence of events that needed verification. At 4 in the morning, I got up, turned on the bedside lamp, and added 6 more notes to the work pages. By dawn, I already had a fairly precise outline of what had probably happened. What I lacked was external confirmation. The official who assisted me was named Rebecca Solano Waitaraga. She was about 45 years old, with short brown hair and a quiet efficiency that I immediately appreciated. No drama, no unnecessary questions. She checked my passport, verified my details in the consular system, took note of the situation I described with precision, and began to process the emergency document with a competence that spoke of years of practice in similar situations. While I waited for the system to process the data, Rebecca told me I could use the landline phone in the waiting room to make the necessary calls. She said it with the same naturalness with which one points out the emergency exit, as part of the protocol, without special emphasis. I thanked her and dialed Consuelo's number. My sister answered on the second ring. Before I said anything, she had already started talking. "Rodrigo, thank God. I've been trying to reach you since yesterday. Your phone is off or tapped, or I don't know what, but no calls are getting through. Listen to me carefully, because this is serious." It wasn't the voice of someone who has just learned something. It was the voice of someone who has been carrying information for hours that is too heavy to continue holding alone. I told her I was in Istanbul, that I was physically fine, that I had my passport, and that I was arranging my return. I asked her to tell me everything from the beginning, in order, without omitting anything. There was a pause of 2 or 3 seconds. Then, Consuelo spoke for almost 12 minutes without me interrupting her. The house in Benimaclet had been sold on Monday, February 4th, 2024, 2 days before I boarded for Istanbul. The transaction was formalized before the notary Evaristo Salcedo Parra through a deed of sale in which Veronica acted as the sole seller, supported by a power of attorney that supposedly authorized me, as a co-owner, to cede all rights to the property. The registered sale price was €320,000. The buyer was a recently incorporated limited company, whose sole administrator was listed as a certain Damian Fuentes Alcanara. I remained completely still when I heard that name. Damian Fuentes, the agent from the letterhead, the letter D on the phone screen, the name printed in the bottom corner of those documents on the kitchen table. He wasn't just the lover, he was the buyer. Consuelo continued. The money from the sale, €320,000, had been transferred to a current account in a bank based in Lisbon, whose ownership was not directly in Veronica's name, but in that of another commercial company indirectly linked through 2 cross-shareholdings. It was an asset concealment structure that any tax auditor would recognize instantly. Simple, but functional for someone without experience in financial tracking. The power of attorney that authorized the sale bore my signature, a signature that I had never put on any document related to that property since the transfer of ownership in 2012. Consuelo didn't know how they had obtained it, but she did know because the neighbor Amparo, remember her, had told her that the notary Salcedo had closed the deal with unusual speed and that there had been no additional identity verification beyond the documentation presented by Veronica and Damian. Then Consuelo paused. I recognized it as the pause of someone who is about to say something they know will hurt. Rodrigo. The deed lists Nestor Medina Castillo as an instrumental witness. The name of my son in that sentence took several seconds to settle in the correct order inside my head. Instrumental witness. It means he was present, that he saw the transaction formalized, that he signed as proof that the act had occurred before him. At 27 years old, with a university degree in business administration and management and full legal capacity. It wasn't ignorance. It wasn't a signature taken out of context. Nestor knew exactly what he was signing. I didn't respond immediately. I heard Consuelo say my name twice to check if I was still on the other end of the line. I told her yes, I was listening. I asked her to stay available for the next few days and not to talk about this with anyone else until I was back in Valencia. I asked her if she could transfer me the amount for a return plane ticket plus a small sum to settle the hotel bill. She said yes, without a moment's hesitation. I hung up. I remained seated in the orange plastic chair in the consulate's waiting room with my hands on my briefcase, looking at the floor without seeing anything in particular. Evaristo Salcedo Parra. I had met him 12 years ago. I had shaken his hand, had signed before him, and at some later point on a date I couldn't yet specify, but that I would find out, someone had offered him enough to authenticate a signature that wasn't mine without performing any of the checks his position legally required of him. The rage came at that moment, not as an explosion, but as a temperature, something rising slowly from my stomach to my chest, sustained and constant, without any of the tremors we associate with unbridled anger. It was the rage of someone who has identified the complete mechanism of a fraud and understands every gear. The kind of rage doesn't scream, it organizes. Rebecca Solano approached with the emergency document and a sheet with instructions for the reimbursement of the consular cash advance. She explained that they had also managed, through the assistance service for Spaniards abroad, to book a return ticket on the first available flight to Valencia, departing that same afternoon at 17:20. The cost would be reimbursed through the usual formal mechanism. I thank her sincerely. I signed a receipt documents. I put the emergency document in the inner pocket of my briefcase next to my passport and left the consulate into the cold Turkish morning air. I had a little less than 8 hours before the flight. I went back to the hotel, settled the bill with the consular advance, and sat in the small dining room on the ground floor to have something hot for breakfast. For the first time since I had landed, I felt real hunger. I ate it attentively, without rushing. Then I took out the pages of notes and continued the outline where I had left it the night before, now adding the data Consuelo had provided. 320,000 euros from the sale. Destination: account in Lisbon via 2 intermediary companies. False power of attorney authenticated by Salcedo. Real buyer: Damian Fuentes, executor of the operation and direct beneficiary. Veronica, seller and architect of the scheme. Nestor, present and signatory as a witness in the deed. And 824. The 8 in the 24 years of marriage, Nestor at 27, which meant that when I came home late and he pretended to be asleep, when I filed the statements without reading, when I considered the arrangement to be reasonable. Someone in that house had been keeping a tally of my every absence with a precision that now became an argument for betrayal. It doesn't justify it. It will never justify it, but it explains it. And understanding the complete mechanism, even the most painful part, is the first thing an auditor needs before dismantling any structure. I closed the folder, ordered another coffee, and waited for the flight with the same methodical calm with which I would wait for the start of an inspection that I already know how it will end. The return flight landed in Valencia at 20:04 hours. I was wearing the same suit I had left in 2 days earlier, wrinkled and with the stuffy smell of someone who has slept in their clothes in a hotel room without spare luggage. I walked through the arrivals terminal with my briefcase, the consular emergency document, and 4 pages of handwritten notes that at that moment were worth more than anything else I could have brought in a suitcase. Consuelo was waiting for me in the outdoor parking lot, leaning against her gray seat, with her arms crossed and an expression that tried to be calm without quite succeeding. When she saw me walk through the automatic exit door, she took a step forward and hugged me with a strength I didn't expect from her. She said nothing for several seconds. Neither did I. When we separated, she looked me in the face with that specific attention of older siblings who assess damage without asking directly. "You look good for what's happened," she said. "I have work to do," I replied. We got in the car. Consuelo drove while I looked out the window at the illuminated signs of the highway leading into the city, the same one I had traveled thousands of times in 26 years of coming and going from the tax agency. Everything looked exactly the same. The same skyline of buildings against the night sky, the same orange streetlights on the damp February asphalt. Only I was different. I asked her to take me directly to German Ortiz's office. It was 8:30 at night. At this hour, Consuelo said, I called him from Ataturk Airport before boarding. He'll be there. German Ortiz Ballesteros had been practicing law in Valencia for 31 years. I knew him from university when we both studied at the Faculty of Law and Economics at the University of Valencia and shared a table in the library on the third floor, where he reviewed civil law and analytical accounting. He was a 62-year-old man with completely white hair and a way of listening that consisted of never interrupting until the other person had finished saying everything they had to say. That quality, which in university seemed like simple courtesy to me, I had come to understand over the years as a technique. German let the story unfold completely because he knew that in the margins of what one says without thinking is where the most useful information appears. He opened the door to his office on Calle Colón himself, with no secretary at that hour, wearing his jacket and with a half-consumed coffee on the meeting table. He made no comment on the state of my suit. He pointed to the chair and waited. I spoke for 40 minutes. I gave him the 4 pages of notes, explained the complete sequence in chronological order, the letter from Adramar Solutions, Veronica's management of the trip, the coffee at the airport, waking up on the plane, the call from the consulate, what Consuelo had confirmed about the deed of sale, the power of attorney with my forged signature, the notary Salcedo, Damian Fuentes as the real buyer, and the €320, 000, transferred to the account in Lisbon. German read the notes as I spoke. He didn't look up from the paper until I finished. There was a silence of almost a minute. The false power of attorney is the central point, he finally said. If the handwriting analysis confirms the signature isn't yours, the deed of sale is left without valid legal support, and the operation can be challenged for absolute nullity. Salcedo is criminally liable for authenticating a false document. That's a crime of falsification of a public instrument, which, depending on how the accusation is constructed, can carry disqualification and a prison sentence. And Damian Fuentes, if it's proven he acted with knowledge of the forgery, is a co-perpetrator. If it's also proven that he facilitated the operation as part of a relationship with the seller, the case against him becomes considerably more complicated. He paused, and the sun. It was the first time since the call with Consuelo that I heard that term referred in Nestor from someone else. German said it with the technical neutrality of someone evaluating a legal position, without intending to hurt and without knowing exactly what weight it had for me at that moment. I told him that Nestor was listed as an instrumental witness in the deed. German nodded slowly, without adding anything more on that point. He jotted it down in his notepad with a single line and moved on to the next issue. That was the most considerate thing he could have done. For the next 20 minutes, we established the initial plan. German would contact a trusted forensic handwriting expert the next day to begin the signature comparison. I would start rebuilding the financial trail of the last 18 months with the bank statements I could retrieve from my access as a co-owner of the family accounts. We would keep the strategy completely under wraps until we had enough documentation to file a solid complaint that left no room for a defensive maneuver. Does Veronica know you're back? German asked before I stood up. Not yet. Good. Don't let her know, for now. I left the office at 10:15 at night. Consuelo was waiting for me in the car parked on the street. She offered me the guest room in her apartment in Patriarchs. I accepted without arguing, but before getting in the car, I asked her to wait a moment. I don't know why I chose that particular moment. Maybe it was the clean cold of the street after the stuffy air of the office. Maybe it was the sound of Valencia functioning normally at that hour. The bars with their shutters half down, a couple of guys on bikes, a dog, someone was walking on the opposite sidewalk. Ordinary life continuing exactly the same, while mine had turned 180 degrees in 48 hours. I leaned against the wall of the building, crossed my arms over my chest, and cried. It wasn't a noisy cry. It was silent and physical, with my shoulders moving slightly and my eyes closed tightly, as if my body needed to expel something that my head had been holding in since the Valencia airport 2 days ago. It lasted 11 minutes. I know because I looked at my watch when it ended with that instinct to record times that I can no longer switch off, even in the most intimate moments. Consuelo didn't get out of the car. She didn't roll down the window to say anything. She stayed inside looking straight ahead, giving me exactly the space I needed without asking me to justify needing it. She's the person who knows me best in the world, and that night, she proved it with a silence that was worth more than any words. When I dried my face and opened the passenger door, she started the engine without commenting, only said, "There's soup at home. I made it before I came." During the drive to Patriarchs, I looked out the window at the streets of the Benamaclet neighborhood. As we passed the facade of our house, the one that was no longer mine, the blinds were down. There was a light on in the living room that filtered through the slats. Someone was inside, living in my house with my money, with the same normalcy with which I had for years taken for granted everything that was now missing. I looked away, looked ahead. That was the only time I allowed myself to feel the full extent of the blow. From that moment on, I stopped being the man who had been robbed. I became the auditor who was going to prove, document by document, every euro, every signature, and every date exactly what had happened. And that, unlike the crying, wasn't going to last 11 minutes. It was going to last as long as necessary, without rush, without error, without leaving any loose ends. On the third day of being at Consuelo's house, Veronica called my sister's landline. She had no other way of reaching me, because the phone I usually used had disappeared along with my wallet that afternoon on the plane, and I hadn't bought a new one yet. Consuelo looked at me from the other end of the hallway with the receiver in her hand and a silent question in her eyes. I gave her an affirmative nod. She passed it to me. Veronica's voice on the other end had exactly the tone I would have expected if I didn't know what I knew. Moderate concern, a bit of contained reproach for not having been in touch sooner, the natural cadence of a wife who hasn't heard from her husband for days. It was a flawless performance. For 24 years I had lived with that voice, and I had never heard in it what I heard now, the thin layer of acting over something that was none of the things she pretended to be. I told her I'd had a problem with my phone upon arriving in Istanbul, that the meetings had been intense and exhausting, that I was fine, but I needed a few days at Consuelo's house to rest before returning to the routine. That the pressure of work had built up in a way I hadn't known how to manage in time. I used vague words of the kind that can't be refuted because they don't state anything concrete. "How many days?" she asked. "As many as I need. I don't know yet." There was a 2-second pause, enough for someone with her level of control to register the information and assess if it posed a risk to the plan she had already executed. She reached the correct conclusion from her perspective. I knew nothing. I was stressed. I needed space. That was manageable. "All right," she said. "Rest. We'll talk when you're better." I hung up. I returned the receiver to Consuelo without making any comment. She didn't ask anything either. That same afternoon, I bought a basic prepaid phone at a shop on Calle Court with a SIM card registered in Consuelo's name to prevent any tracking from being linked to me ahead of time. It was a probably unnecessary precaution, but the technical instinct operated above probabilities. In tax fraud cases, the investigated party's mistakes almost always occurred at moments when they thought precaution was superfluous. The forensic handwriting expert that German had contacted was named Aurelio Vega Montesinos. He was 58 years old. He had a doctorate in forensic sciences from the Complutense University and had been conducting expert analyses for courts throughout Spain for over 2 decades. German explained that Aurelio had testified in more than 400 judicial proceedings and that none of his reports had ever been dismissed for technical defects. He was the type of professional that defense lawyers avoided facing in court because his conclusions came with a level of documentation that made them very costly to question. The 3 of us met in German's office on Friday morning. Aurelio was a man of slim build, with thin-framed glasses and a meticulousness in his speech that reminded me of certain inspectors I had worked with at the agency. I gave him a sample of my signature on 6 different documents of various dates, from service contracts to administrative requests from the last 10 years. He examined them for several minutes with a magnifying glass, took notes in a hardcover notebook, and said he would need access to a certified copy of the power of attorney to complete the comparison. German had already requested that copy from the corresponding notarial registry. It would arrive within 5 to 8 business days. "That's enough for the preliminary report," said Aurelio. "If the signature is an imitation, I will establish it with certainty. If it's a forgery built on a digitally manipulated original signature, that too, the 2 options leave different traces and neither is invisible under instrumental analysis." He left the office with the samples in a sealed folder. German and I were left alone. I gave him the first results of the work I had started that week. An analysis of bank statement from the last 22 months that I had reconstructed by accessing the family accounts where I was still listed as a co-owner from Consuelo's computer. What I found in that initial review was enough to confirm that the sale of the house hadn't been an impulsive act, but the final point of a strategy that had been under construction for almost 2 years. There were recurring transfers of amounts ranging from €600 to €1,100, always made on business days between 10 and 12 in the morning, when Veronica knew I was at the office and unlikely to check the online banking access. Individually, each one could be justified as a domestic or personal expense without raising any alarms. Collectively, the accumulated sum exceeded €86,000 distributed over 73 different operations over 19 months. 73 operations, none above the mandatory reporting threshold to the bank. It was a technique that in the field of tax auditing has its own name, deliberate splitting. I knew it because I had documented it in at least a dozen files throughout my career. I had never imagined finding it in my own statements. German reviewed the analysis carefully. "This reinforces the picture of premeditation," he said. "It's not a decision made in a moment of marital crisis. It's a financial architecture built with time and method." I asked him about the estimated timelines for the full judicial proceeding. He explained that challenging the deed for document forgery, once the complaint was filed with the expert report as support, would follow the ordinary channels of the investigating court. The precautionary measure to suspend the effects of the sale could be requested simultaneously with the complaint, which would prevent the property from being sold or mortgaged again while the process was open. It was a slow mechanism compared to the speed with which they had executed their plan, but it was irreversible if the documents held up to judicial scrutiny, and they would hold up. What German didn't know, and what I hadn't yet verbalized out loud to anyone, was the part of the strategy that had no legal component. The decision about Nestor couldn't be processed in legal terms because there was no crime to prosecute in signing as a witness on a public deed. It was a civil act, completely legal in its form, devastating in its meaning. That week, at night, in Consuelo's guest room, I thought about it with a regularity I couldn't interrupt even if I wanted to. Nestor was 27. He had grown up in that house with the marks on the doorframe. He had eaten at that table hundreds of times. He had received a monthly allowance for years that I transferred punctually without him asking, because I considered it my responsibility as a father to ensure his professional start didn't depend on the circumstances of the job market. And he had put his signature on a deed that was intended to empty me of everything. One night, while reviewing the statements for the 4th time in search of some detail I might have missed, I got up from the chair, went to the bathroom, turned on the cold water tap, and splashed my face for a long time without looking at myself in the mirror, not to avoid my reflection, but because there was nothing to tell myself that I didn't already know. The decision about Nestor was made. I wouldn't execute it yet because the moment wasn't right, but it was made with the same firmness with which a case file is closed, with no possible appeal, no review clause, no room for ambiguity. There were weeks to go before everything reached the point where each piece would fall into its final place. During that time, I would continue to do what I had done all my life. Work with order, document with precision, and not move any piece before the board was complete. Veronica was still in that house with the blinds down and the light on in the living room, convinced that the man she had sent to Istanbul was too disoriented to pose any real threat. That was the last advantage she had left, and it was about to run out. The preliminary report from Aurelio Vega Montesinos arrived at German's office on the Wednesday of the third week. German called me on the prepaid phone at 9 in the morning with a single sentence. "Come when you can. We have confirmation." Aurelio had completed the comparison between the 6 samples of my authentic signature and the one that appeared on the notarial power of attorney. His conclusion, written in 17 pages with photographic support and instrumental analysis, was unequivocal. The signature on the power of attorney wasn't mine. It was an imitation built on the general features of my usual handwriting, probably elaborated from a digital reproduction of a signature of mine obtained from some previous document. The pressure angles didn't match those of any of my samples. The initial stroke had a hesitation characteristic of someone reproducing rather than executing, and the proportion between the modules of the letters differed by a percentage that far exceeded the threshold of natural variation between different signatures of the same individual. 17 pages, photographs, instrumental analysis, a conclusion with no room for ambiguity. German began the process of filing the formal complaint with the investigating court within 10 days, the time needed to incorporate all the financial documentation I was still building into the file. Those 10 days were the most technically intense of the entire process. I worked every morning from 6 until noon at Consuelo's dining table with the printed bank statements organized chronologically, a spreadsheet built column by column, and the same method I applied in any audit of a medium-sized company. First the total volume, then the frequency, then the pattern, then the recipient. The pattern was visible from the second week of analysis. The 73 transfers I had identified in the initial review followed a cadence that wasn't random, but deliberately designed to appear so. Different amounts in each operation, varied days of the week, irregular intervals between one and the next, at first glance ordinary administrative chaos. Under cumulative frequency analysis, a linear progression that advanced towards a specific date with the regularity of a clock. That date was February 4th, 2024, the day of the deed. But what transformed the analysis from useful to devastating was what I found when I cross-referenced the recipients of those transfers with the commercial registry. 20 of the 73 operations didn't go to the usual domestic account or to any identifiable service provider. They went to a current account registered in the name of a company called Alcantara Gestion Patrimonial SL, established 16 months before the sale with a single administrator, Damian Fuentes Alcantara. He wasn't just the buyer of the property. He was the direct recipient of part of the prior financial draining, which meant that Veronica hadn't paid for his services with the money from the sale. She had been paying him over 16 months in discrete installments while the plan took shape. It was a sustained economic relationship over time, not a one-off transaction, that changed the legal qualification of the whole thing in a way that German would need to assess. I sent him the complete analysis that same afternoon by courier in a sealed envelope, without attaching a summary or explanation. The numbers spoke with enough clarity. German's call came that night. "With this, it's not just document forgery and fraud anymore," he said. "We're looking at a fraudulent organization with its own financial structure, operational for over a year. That aggravates the picture very significantly for both of them." I asked about Salcedo, the notary. Salcedo authenticated a false signature, with Aurelio's report on the table. His position is indefensible. What we don't know yet is whether he acted out of gross negligence or by prior agreement with Fuentes. If we can prove he received some kind of economic compensation for that act, the applicable penalty increases considerably. I told him I would check if there was any movement towards Salcedo's circle in the statements I hadn't fully cross-referenced yet. German paused briefly. "Rodrigo, you've been working for 3 weeks, as if this were a case from the agency. Are you sleeping?" I told him enough. It wasn't entirely accurate, but it wasn't a lie either. I slept 4 or 5 hours. The rest of the time was occupied by the analysis, or the analysis occupied the time that should have been rest. It was hard to distinguish. 2 days later, I found what I was looking for. In the statements from a period I had initially dismissed as being before the scheme began, there were 2 transfers to an account whose number I didn't recognize on first review. The first was for €3,200 made in October 2022, the second for €4,500 in January 2023. Both from the domestic account managed by Veronica. Both on days when I was out of Valencia for work inspections. The holder of that account was an administrative services company called Gestión Documental Salcedo Ejidos. I stared at that name for almost a minute without moving a muscle. Evaristo Salcedo hadn't committed gross negligence. He had been paid first a part to prepare the ground, then another to execute. A total of €7,700 to authenticate a false signature on a €320,000 deed. It was such a small proportion of the fraud's volume that it was almost obscene, but it was traceable, documented, and absolutely sufficient to support a charge of active bribery. I added it to the file without any special emotional inflection. It was simply another piece that fit where it should. That was what systematic financial analysis did. It didn't produce surprises, it produced confirmations. The surprises were for those who hadn't applied the method from the beginning. That same afternoon, something happened that I hadn't calculated. I was sitting at Consuelo's dining table with the papers spread out when the building's intercom buzzed. Consuelo was at the market. I answered out of inertia without thinking that it wasn't my house. The voice on the other end was Veronica's. "Rodrigo, Consuelo told me you were here. We need to talk. I'm coming up." There was no time to completely gather the papers. I pushed the 3 folders into my work bag. I placed a copy of that morning's newspaper on top and took the laptop to the bedroom in 10 seconds. When Veronica walked through the door, she found a man sitting at the table with the newspaper open and a cup of cold coffee. She looked at me for a moment with an attention that lasted a bit longer than natural. "You look good," she said with almost the same tone as Consuelo, but with a completely different intention. It was an evaluation, not a relief. We talked for 20 minutes. She said she was worried about my distance, that it wasn't like me to isolate myself like that the house felt strange without me. She said it with a genuinely convincing cadence. If I hadn't had 3 folders with 73 documented transfers in the bag resting against the wall less than a meter from where she was sitting, I might have doubted. But I had them, and I didn't doubt. I told her I needed time, that she would understand, that soon everything would go back to its place. She left convinced that I was still the same disoriented man who had called from the consulate in Istanbul. I closed the door, returned to the table, took out the folders, and continued where I had left off. There were 4 days left before German filed the complaint. 4 days in which Veronica would continue living with the certainty of having one. That certainty was the only luxury she could still afford, and it had an expiration date. The complaint was filed on the Tuesday of the 4th week. Herman entered investigating Court Number 7 of Valencia with a 104-page file that included the expert report from Aurelio Vega Montesinos, the complete financial analysis of 73 transfers, the documentation linking Damian Fuentes to the prior payments through all contra Gestión Patrimonial SL, and the 2 movements to the account of Gestión Documental Salcedo Ejidos. He simultaneously requested the precautionary measure to suspend the effects of the deed of sale, which blocked any future operations on the property, while the proceeding was active. German called me as he left the courthouse, admitted for processing, the precautionary measure too. From now on, no one could do anything with that house. I hung up the phone and stood in the hallway of Consuelo's apartment for a long moment, without moving anywhere. It wasn't relief exactly, it was the cold recognition that the mechanism had engaged, and that from that point on, the judicial machinery would operate with its own inertia, regardless of what Veronica, Damian, or Salcedo decided to do next. That night, Consuelo prepared a simple dinner. We both ate at the kitchen table without talking much, with the television on in the living room, without either of us watching it. It was a comfortable silence of the kind that is only built between people who have known each other for decades without needing to fill the space with words when there's nothing urgent to say. After clearing the table, Consuelo retired early. I remained seated with the kitchen light on and a glass of untouched water in front of me. I wasn't sleepy, nor did I have work to complete. The complaint was filed, the file submitted, the strategy in German's hands. For the first time in 4 weeks, there was no pending technical task to occupy my hands. It was in that void that what I had been postponing arrived. I got up to look for something in the jacket I had hung on the coat rack in the hall, and, putting my hand in the inner pocket, I felt a small, rigid object I didn't expect to find. It was a wallet-sized photograph with slightly curved edges from time and a small stain in the lower corner that had been there for years, without my remembering when it had appeared. I took it out under the hallway light. It was Nestor. He must have been 5 or 6 years old. He was on the beach in Culera, one summer in the early 2000s, with his dark, wet hair stuck to his forehead and his arms extended towards the camera, holding a medium-sized silver fish that must have seemed enormous to him at the time. His mouth was open in a laugh that couldn't be heard, but that could be seen completely, with all his baby teeth still intact, and his eyes squinted from the midday light. I had taken that photograph. I remembered the moment. He had caught the fish with a cheap plastic rod we had bought that same morning at a hardware store in the town. And the excitement had been so overwhelming and so genuine that I had to take 3 steps back to frame his whole body in the viewfinder of the disposable camera we were using that summer. It had been a Saturday with no work obligations, one of the few. I leaned against the hallway wall with the photograph between my fingers. I stood like that for a time I didn't measure. Not crying this time, without any of the physical movements that had marked the night in front of German's office. Just still, with that specific weight that comes with the recognition of something that can no longer be changed, not the betrayal itself. But the distance that existed between the boy in the photograph and the 27-year-old man who had signed as a witness on a notarial deed with full awareness of what that signature meant. That distance hadn't been created solely by Veronica. I had laid the building materials over years of absences, late dinners, weekends occupied by files that could have waited until Monday. It didn't excuse him, but it was part of the complete picture, and to look at it without that detail would have been the same as auditing a company while deliberately omitting a column from a balance sheet. The decision I had mentally made weeks ago in Consuelo's bathroom settled at that moment in a different way, not with coldness, but with clarity. It wasn't punishment, wasn't revenge. It was simply the recognition that certain choices have permanent consequences and that treating them as temporary would be a way of lying to both of us. Nestor had chosen with all the available information, with a university education, with full legal capacity, in an act that admitted no ambiguous interpretation. To respect that choice meant accepting its consequences without softening them over time. I put the photograph in my pocket. I went back to the kitchen. I drank the water I had left untouched. There was no more crying that night. What there was something more permanent, a kind of internal closure, without a slammed door, without elevated temperature, without any of the dramatic gestures we associate with big decisions. Just a door closing slowly, with the smoothness of something that has been moving in that direction for years and that finally reaches its definitive position. The next morning, I called German to communicate something that wasn't part of the judicial procedure, but that I needed to have registered in someone's presence. When all this is over, I said, I need you to help me draft a document for Nestor. Not a lawsuit. There's no prosecutable crime in what he did, and I have no intention of fabricating one. I want a notarial letter that formally communicates the termination of any financial obligation on my part towards him, effective immediately from the date of signing, with no review clause, no grace period. German was silent for several seconds. It was the silence of someone processing a decision and evaluating it, not in legal terms, but in human terms. Have you thought about this for a while? He finally asked. For weeks, I replied. All right, we'll prepare it when the time comes. The following weeks passed in a kind of watchful pause. German handled the notifications from the court. Aurelio was available for any extension of the report the investigator might request. I had returned to work at the tax agency, where no one knew anything about what was happening in my personal life because I never mixed those spaces that way. Veronica had received the judicial notification. German informed me that her initial response, through a public defender she hired in the first days, had been to deny the forgery of the power of attorney and to allege that I had signed the document voluntarily at an earlier time and simply didn't remember it. It was the only possible line of defense from her position, and it was also the most fragile because it was up against 17 pages of instrumental analysis signed by Aurelio Vega Montesinos, which said exactly the opposite. Damian Fuentes had hired a criminal lawyer from Valencia with a reputation for being aggressive in court. Salcedo remained silent through his legal representative. The three of them were acting as those implicated in a fraud always act when they know they're trapped by solid documentation, hoping that something will fail in the chain of evidence, looking for the weak link that might offer a way out. There was none. They knew it, and I knew it. The preliminary hearing was set for the third week of April. 22 days to go. 22 days in which Veronica still slept in that house in Benimaclet with the blinds down and the living room light on. 22 days in which Damian Fuentes continued to work as a real estate agent in his office on Calle Colón, less than 4 kilometers from where I had spent 26 years working. 22 days in which the notary Salcedo opened his office every morning in the Razafa neighborhood, with the same plaque on the door and the same protocol as always. None of the three knew that the file they were facing had been built with the same precision with which I build the files they present to the tax agency. People who believed no one would review their numbers carefully enough. They were mistaken with the same error they always make, underestimating someone who has the experience they never took the time to accumulate. Investigating Court Number 7 of Valencia occupies the 4th floor of a gray-faced building on Calle Balin, with beige linoleum hallways and fluorescent lighting that flattens the colors of everything beneath it. I arrived at 9:44 on the morning of April 16th wearing the dark blue suit I reserve for important professional appearances and a folder under my arm that was the organized and bound version of everything I had built over the last few weeks. German was already in the hallway, standing by the courtroom door, with his briefcase and the same serene expression as always. "How are you?" he asked. "Prepared," I answered. It was the truth without nuances. The room was small, with a long central table, chairs with stiff backs, and a narrow window that looked out onto an inner courtyard where no sun entered at that hour. The investigating judge was named Dolores Izquierdo Carmona. She was about 50, with her hair simply tied back and dark-rimmed glasses that she never took off. She reviewed the documents German placed on the table with the focused attention of someone who has seen many files and knows how to distinguish those that have substance from those that don't. Veronica was sitting on the other side of the table with her lawyer, a thin man of about 40 named Hector Balmaceda, who had built his defense on a single premise, that I suffered from memory deterioration linked to chronic work-related stress and that I had signed the power of attorney voluntarily, without remembering it later. It was a strategy that would have worked against any other man in any other circumstance. Against 17 pages of graphological instrumental analysis, it worked against nothing. Damian Fuentes was sitting next to his criminal lawyer, Gonzalo Prades Herrero, a burly man with a thick beard who, during the first minutes of the session, adopted a posture of slight disinterest, like someone who figures the proceeding lacks enough substance to pose a real risk. That posture began to change as German started placing documents on the table. Salcedo attended accompanied by his representative, but did not speak at any point during the session. He remained with his hands clasped on the table and his gaze fixed on a neutral point on the opposite wall, with the contained expression of someone who already knows what's coming and has decided not to accelerate the process with any unnecessary movement. German presented the case in strictly chronological order. First, the context, the 2012 decision that transferred the ownership of the property to Veronica's exclusive name, presented then as a temporary asset protection measure and never reversed. The first knot tied. What had seemed like a prudent family management decision was the first stone of an architecture built years in advance. Next, the financial pattern, the 73 split transfers over 19 months, the accumulated sum of 86,000 euros, the payments to all Contra Gestion Patrimonial SL, with Damian Fuentes as the sole administrator. German placed the analysis table I had prepared on the table. Prades, Fuentes' lawyer, leaned forward to read it and did not resume his posture of disinterest. Then the power of attorney, the report from Aurelio Vega Montesinos with its 17 pages, the comparative photographs, the analysis of pressure and proportion, the conclusion with no room for ambiguity. The signature wasn't mine. The second not. The notary Salcedo, whose name I had first heard from Veronica's mouth 12 years ago as a trustworthy recommendation. He had authenticated a false document for a payment of 7,700 euros channeled through his family business. Third not. Then, German placed the final sheet of the file, the letterhead of Inmobiliaria Alcantara, Y Associados with Damian Fuentes' name, printed in the bottom corner. The same paper I had found on the kitchen table one Saturday morning, which Veronica had explained as documentation for her cousin Dolores, and which I had closed and filed without asking anything further. Fourth not. Judge Izquierdo reviewed each document with long pauses. There was no urgency in her way of working. It was the calm of someone who knows that what's in front of her isn't going to change between one page and the next. It was during that pause that I looked at Veronica for the first time since we had entered the room. She was sitting with her back straight and her hands clasped on the table, just as she had been for the first part of the session. But there was something different in the line of her jaw, a tension that wasn't there when she arrived, as if the muscles had been holding something that weighed more than calculated for a while. She looked at me for a second. It was a brief exchange of glances, without words, without gestures, but in that second, I saw something that in 24 years of marriage I had only seen in her on rare occasions. Genuine uncertainty, not satisfaction on my part, just recognition. The same that I feel when, in an audit, the person of interest understands at what point in the process they are and stops pretending the outcome can be different. The judge looked up from the file and directed a technical question to German about the chain of custody of the bank statements. German answered with precision. The judge took a note, then looked at Balmaceda, Veronica's lawyer, with an attention that wasn't hostile, but also left no room for optimism. Balmaceda argued for 8 minutes, repeated the line about memory deterioration, added that the financial movements could be interpreted as ordinary domestic expenses without a fraudulent structure, and questioned the impartiality of the handwriting expert due to his prior professional relationship with German. It was what could be done with what he had. It wasn't enough, and everyone in that room knew it, including him. Judge Izquierdo suspended the session to deliberate and announced that she would issue her resolution on the precautionary measure within a maximum of 48 hours. We went out into the hallway. German and I sat on the wooden bench next to the window. Fuentes left, flanked by Prades, without looking in any particular direction. Salcedo disappeared down the opposite end of the hallway, without saying a word to anyone. Veronica was the last to leave, accompanied by Balmaceda, and she stopped for a moment as she passed in front of us. She looked at me with an expression that took me several seconds to identify, because I didn't expect to find it in that context. It wasn't anger, it wasn't contempt, it was something akin to the perplexity of someone who calculated every variable of a complex operation and discovered at the end that they had omitted the most important one. I said nothing. There was nothing to say that the documents hadn't already said with more precision. Balmaceda gently took her arm, and they continued walking towards the elevator. The next 48 hours were the slowest of the entire process. Not because of anxiety, but because of contrast. After weeks of constant technical activity, the wait without a specific task weighed differently. Consuelo forced me to go for a walk 2 afternoons in a row, through Viveros Park, something I hadn't done in years. We walked without talking much among the trees with the first buds of April, and it was the first time in a long time that my body was in one place without my head being in another. The resolution arrived on Thursday afternoon. Judge Izquierdo confirmed the validity of the already active precautionary measure, ordered the formal opening of criminal proceedings for document forgery in a public instrument, aggravated fraud, and active bribery against Veronica Castillo Fuentes, Damian Fuentes Alcantara, and Evaristo Salcedo Parra, and declared the provisional nullity of the deed of sale dated February 4th. 2024, with suspension of all its legal effects until a final resolution. German read it to me over the phone, paragraph by paragraph. When he finished, I put the phone in my pocket and went out onto the balcony of Consuelo's apartment. It was a clear afternoon, with that clean air that Valencia sometimes has in spring when the wind comes from the north and sweeps away the humidity from the sea. I rested my hands on the railing and looked at the neighborhood rooftops for a while, without thinking about anything specific, letting the silence occupy the space that for weeks had been filled by numbers, statements, the pages of the expert report, and the names of the people who had believed they could build a fraudulent structure against someone without calculating that this someone had spent 3 decades dismantling exactly that type of structure. The house in Benimaclet was still standing with the marks on the doorframe, with the terrace from which you could see the patch of orange sky at sunset, with everything it had been before someone decided it could be sold without my consent. I was going to get it back. But that was no longer the most important part of what was left to do. The verdict arrived 3 months later. It was Tuesday, July 9th, 2024. German called me at 11:43 in the morning. His voice, usually restrained, had that vibration that only appears when a long battle ends, and the result has surpassed even the most cautious expectations. Everything has been resolved as it should, was the first thing he said. Judge Izquierdo Carmona issued a final resolution, full nullity of the deed, complete restitution of the property to the estate of Rodrigo Medina Serrano, and criminal convictions for the 3 involved. Veronica Castillo Fuentes, 3 years and 8 months in prison for document forgery and aggravated fraud. Damian Fuentes Alcantara, for years and 2 months for co-perpetration and partial money laundering. Evaristo Salcedo Parra, 6 years of professional disqualification for bribery. The costs of the proceedings would be borne entirely by the convicted. She also ordered the return of the diverted funds, €86,000 plus accumulated interest, blocked until that moment in the Portuguese account used for the triangulation. The circuit was fully traced thanks to the accounting evidence attached to the file. No lawyer could refute a single figure. I remember I remained silent, not out of surprise, but from the quiet certainty that everything had happened exactly as it should have. I felt that every sleepless night, every cold coffee, every file reviewed until dawn, and every line written in my notebooks had a purpose. German suggested we celebrate something that afternoon. I gently declined the idea. I told him I preferred to stop by the property before anything else. I wanted to see it with my own eyes, in silence, alone. I drove slowly to Benimaclet, along the same avenue I had traveled so many times on my way home when we still existed. As I turned the corner, I saw the facade. The for sale sign had been removed. The blinds were halfway up, the paint somewhat faded by the dust of the months. I crossed the rusty gate of the front garden and stood there, observing the wooden door with the same marks I myself had made year after year to measure Nestor's height. The lock turned with a familiar sound. Inside, it smelled musty, of slight dampness, of an unused house. I walked down the hall to the dining room, where the yellowish shadows of the paintings Veronica had removed before the sale still remained. I placed a folder on the empty table, like placing a finished report. There was no fiery emotion, just a weight lifting from my shoulders, making room for air. I ran my fingers over the doorframe, right where the lines with dates were 2003, 2007, 2010, written in blue pen. I stopped my gaze on the last one, 2014. That was the last time I measured Nestor before he started to pull away. I dusted off the furniture and sat in the same chair as always. The afternoon light came through the patio window, casting a golden strip across the floor. I thought about everything that had moved since that morning at the airport. The image of Veronica with the coffee cup, the metallic taste, the alarm on my watch, the names that appeared one after another like a ciphered code that only I could solve. And then everything that came after, the reconstruction, the complaint, the courtroom, the final look. I didn't feel hatred. Hatred exhausts itself quickly, and what remained was something cleaner, akin to the calm of someone who has returned every number of an altered account to its proper place. Weeks later, I signed the notarial letter for Nestor. German drafted it according to my exact instructions, without harshness, without drama, without explicit resentment, just facts and a final decision. As of this date, all material obligation on my part towards you is extinguished. Do not seek financial reconciliation or intermediation. It is not rejection, it is coherence. A father teaches even when he chooses distance, and this will be yours. I signed it with a firm hand and gave the original to German for his records. Then I kept a copy in the blue folder inside the metal drawer of my desk. I haven't opened it again, Consuelo insisted. More than once that time can soften things. Maybe she's right on the surface, but there are marbles that no rain can polish. The relationship with Nestor was extinguished the exact minute his signature accompanied that deed. Not because I needed revenge, but because there are lines that, if crossed, erase everything that came before. Veronica entered prison in October after her lawyer's appeal was rejected. Damian sold his office and disappeared from Valencia before being officially notified, but they caught him 3 months later in Granada. Salcedo closed his notary office, citing health reasons. None of the three ever wrote to me again. I didn't expect them to. The state restored the property to me, not just physically, but in the records. From a legal perspective, everything was as it was before the betrayal. But that's something paper doesn't understand. The house became mine again, although the feeling of home never fully returned. In the autumn of that year, I decided to rent it out, not as a refuge for others, but as a way to keep it alive without returning to the past. I used a discreet agency. The person who lives there now knows nothing of what happened, and that's how it should remain. My current address is not in any accessible public record. I live near the sea, in a small apartment where every object has its place. Order, silence, precision. Sometimes at dawn, I make coffee and let the aroma fill the room. It doesn't smell like the one from the airport. This one has a clean scent, without artifice. I drink it slowly, watching the sun come in over the desk. There are days when I still surprise myself, mentally calculating the interest on the recovered money or remembering the sounds of the courthouse hallway. Not out of nostalgia, out of habit. An auditor's brain doesn't turn off. It just archives. I've come to understand that the most valuable thing I was left with wasn't the house, nor the money, nor the legal victory. It was the certainty that even after losing everything at once, a man can rebuild it by applying the same logic he used to build it the first time, step by step, with method, with patience. Every number fits back into place. Every document finds its place. Every lie ends up having an exact correspondence with the fact that refutes it. That's what I learned, and that's what I want to have written down, even if no one else reads it. I still keep the photograph of Nestor with the silver fish on the beach in Culera. I never threw it away. It's in the top drawer of my desk, protected inside a transparent plastic sleeve. Sometimes I look at it for a moment and put it away again, not out of sadness, but for memory, because memory, when used with order, is also a form of justice. And so I close this cycle. The house recovered, the guilty convicted, the distant sun, the coffee without poison in the cup. Nothing will ever be the same as before, and that's okay. In the same spot where 11 years ago I had written the last mark of his height, I rested my pen and drew another number of mine. 2024, not to measure growth, but to record survival. Then I turned off the light. I walked out the front door and turned the key in the opposite direction. The sound of the lock was crisp, final, and exact like the closing of a perfect audit.